Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, and welcome to this episode of Sharia Intelligence, where we are still looking at the Islamic legal maxims or Qawaid al-Fiqhiyah. I'm your host Muhammad Nuruddin Lemu, and with me to discuss today's topics are two of our distinguished facilitators, volunteers with the Da'wah Institute, trainers in this course, Sharia Intelligence, Sister Salatu Saleh and Brother Ibrahim Bello. Assalamu alaikum, you're both welcome.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Today we'll be looking at the fourth of the five universal maxims, al-mashaqqa tajlibu taysir, that hardship or constraint calls for ease and facilitation. I'd like to start with Sister Salatu. What does this maxim actually mean? What's the implication? What's it trying to promote or protect?
Okay. Al-mashaqqa tajlibu taysir. Difficulty calls for ease or facilitation. One way of remembering it, at least one way I found easy to understand it, its essence, is to add a few more words. That a person in a state of difficulty or a person facing hardship requires some concessions. Let's look at the word hardship. What does it imply here? We know that in life there are difficulties we will face. Some of these difficulties we call necessary. Some we say cannot be avoided, unavoidable. Some come as part of a necessary part of the pursuit of some of these higher objectives of Sharia, improving one's life, living standard, or protecting one's family or raising a family, and so on and so forth. Let's use a common example. If you want to become physically fit, you want to have stronger muscles, you will have to carry out some exercise, lift some weights, maybe do some running or jogging or swimming. And those actions necessarily cause wear and tear. The muscles tear, sometimes you suffer a sprain. It doesn't mean that you should therefore stop. It just means you cope with that. You try to give your body time to rest or recover.
It's beneficial.
Because it's beneficial, because it's a necessary part of that process. However, you will be told that, let's say for instance, you already have a physical condition, a health condition, that will be made worse by a particular form of exercise. You will be advised not to do it. Or somebody starts off the very first time they want to try weightlifting, they lift 4 kilograms. The following day, they want to go immediately to 8, and the day after, they want to shoot to 10 or 12. A trainer, an expert, anybody with common sense will tell them you are going to fast. It is not necessary to harm yourself in this way or strain yourself in this way in order to attain that goal. You can do it with less. That essentially is what this particular maxim is saying, that any hardship that is unnecessary, that is not beneficial, that the harm it will bring is greater than the harm that goal is meant to prevent, such hardship makes it compulsory that a person facing it should have some concessions. Things should be made easy for the person. And we are talking about hardship that is in pursuit of the attainment of certain goals, certain obligations, or fulfillment of obligations. So any hardship that will stop someone from fulfilling their obligation should be enough reason to give the person concession. Any difficulty that will hinder someone from fulfilling their obligations, from living what we call a good life from the Islamic perspective, should be given some concessions. This hardship is connected, very closely connected to this maxim, is very closely connected to the maxim we discussed previously, ad-darar yuzal. Sometimes people ask, what's the difference? When I teach students this, they ask, what's the difference? Is it not the same thing? And then we go further and we say, okay, let's look at it this way. Ad-darar yuzal, harm must be eliminated. Let's put in a few more words. Whatever is causing harm, the source of harm should be removed or stopped. When we are looking at a problem from the perspective of ad-darar yuzal, harm should be eliminated. We are looking at the entire problem. We are looking at the entire setting, the scenario. And the attempt or the effort we make in that case is to solve the problem or stop it from coming up. When we are looking at a situation from the point of view of al-mashaqat tajlib at-taysir, we are now looking at who is being impacted upon by this problem, or who will be impacted upon by the problem in this situation. So we are moving away from the situation and we are looking much more closely on the individual. We are looking at away from statistics and data where you say 30 people could die in a fire. It's no longer just 30 people, so we are looking away from data and we are looking at the people that the data represents. So we are looking at the people, their context, their reality. Or where you say, you know, if we take this policy, it's not too bad, it's just 5% of the population that will be wrongly impacted. When you say just 5%, in terms of numbers, you are correct. But in terms of people, it's not just anymore to each one of the people represented by the 5%. So this particular maxim is a maxim that calls for concern for people, compassion for people, and looking at how to grant concessions. So when we look at taysir, facilitation, making things easy, concession, what do we mean by concession? It's relaxing rules, relaxing laws, suspending punishments. It's by providing ease and relief. It's also by creating alternatives for individuals in a situation. It could also be in terms of compensation. So you may not be able to solve a problem entirely. You may not be able to prevent a problem, but you would say who is being impacted as long as the problem exists, and what kind of compensation or relief can be given to that person. When we also look at this maxim and how it operates in the justice system, whether we are talking about Sharia law or common law or whatever other legal system there is, when a crime is committed, what often happens is the perpetrator of the crime is punished. And very often it's said justice is done. If you look at justice from the perspective of this maxim, the person in a state of difficulty should be granted some relief, then you would not stop at just punishing the perpetrator. We would then look at restorative justice. Restorative justice is saying, yes, look at the crime, look at the perpetrator, but what about the victim? Because if somebody steals from me and the person goes to prison, but what has been stolen is not replaced, especially if it's something vital, then I'm still in difficulty because that thing hasn't come back. Even when we look at crimes like sexual crimes, the person is punished, sent to jail, flogged, castrated, whatever other thing that people are suggesting. What happens to the person who continues to suffer the effects of that action? What happens to the person whose arm was cut off when they had intertribal or interracial conflict? So it's about focusing on the victim. In order to actually apply this maxim, put it to work, put it to practice in our everyday lives, it's necessary that there should be experts. Experts who can do thorough, accurate, data-based impact assessment, who can assess the extent to which a person or people have suffered or will suffer from a situation. Now, I use the will suffer because, as we mentioned when we're talking about adwar or yuzal, that there are situations where harm must be done. It becomes inevitable. A certain action must be taken that will cause a problem or difficulty to people. For instance, you need to construct a bridge, or a road needs to be made wider because population has increased and you're getting these traffic jams.
Or curfew.
Or curfew has to be imposed. Those decisions are never taken lightly by any serious government. They are taken after careful thought and consideration, very often with the government thinking about prevention. If you keep having traffic jams, traffic congestion at a particular point, what are the likely problems that will be caused beyond inconvenience? Someone going to the hospital and needs to get there in time but runs into a traffic jam. the state of mind that is caused by a traffic jam, where people then start driving in a much more frenzied way. So the government looks at that. But to widen a road or create an overpass often or sometimes means some people's homes will be destroyed. Their buildings will have to be brought down. Al-Mashaqat tajlibu at-taysir, difficulty requires facilitation, requires that the action will be taken because it's necessary, but the experts have to slow down and say whose home, whose business, in what way will people be adversely affected, and therefore how do we grant them relief? What kind of compensation will we give? It's important, I think, at this point to mention, as we said when we're talking about when does it become necessary that certain professions, you must have people there, certain experts, you must have people there. It's necessary, therefore, to say that Muslims need to start looking at these areas of impact assessment, analysis, and say, okay, can Muslims go more and more into these fields? Because a Muslim who is learned, who understands this area, al-Qawaid, goes into such fields, and when they are doing analysis, hopefully they are more mindful of the importance of carefully checking who will be adversely affected by a decision. So even when it comes to issues to do with public policy, and people carry out research and studies to prevent or to grant relief, it's essential that Muslims continue to look at going into such fields and attaining a high level of expertise in those fields, so that they can bring the wisdom of the Islamic sciences, which we are discussing right now, particularly these qawaid, the common sense, as I said, and inject them into everyday life for humanity.
This is all really interesting, but what it also implies is that this decision making regarding relief,
yes,
and concession and the measuring of suffering may not be the expertise of Islamic studies, may
No.
not be in the field of your average sheikh, how
Or
dire,
imam.
or imam. So the decision of should we have a curfew or not, should we have lockdowns, should we, when do we do these things? The key thing in these maxims is for those in authority to have guidance and the religious backing. And as you've already mentioned, when we talk about al-mashaqqa tajlibu at-taysir, it reminds me in Hausa, in one of our languages, the word shaqi means to choke. That al-mashaqqa tajlibu at-taysir is when people are getting choked,
Yeah.
when people are having detrimental suffering. Not just the hardship of life, because if you have to work hard,
Yeah.
and you are hardworking, doesn't mean that type of hardship, no pain, no gain type, but unnecessary suffering
Preventable.
that is preventable, that is
Yes.
not bringing benefit. We should find all our ways, not just of removing it, ad-darar yuzal,
Yeah.
but as you've mentioned, to be victim-centric, to show compassion, to those going through the side effects, so
Yeah.
to speak, of these.
If I can add something, I think I remember over time and even growing up, people would often say one of the inevitable difficulties that people must face is the pains that come with childbirth. And they'll say it's unavoidable, it must happen. It's interesting to know now with the use of epidural that many are now choosing, because it's now being viewed based on knowledge now and technology that that degree of pain that comes with childbirth can be avoided, can be prevented. Of course, in the early years, there was a lot of concern about, so if you inject an epidural, what if there's injury to the spinal cord and so on. But as doctors have become more familiar with the use, they've also reduced the danger that comes with that. So I think it harks back to that idea that we mentioned when we're talking about ad-darar yuzal, the prevention of harm, that it's not enough to say if I see it, I'll stop it, but to actually say, is there harm occurring here? Yes. Right now, is it inevitable? Yes. However, through effort, searching, investigation, research, questioning, critical thinking, we could actually start to reduce the harm and start finding that it's no longer as inevitable as we thought.
It's not necessarily
Not
beneficial
necessary,
suffering.
Yes.
Malam Ibrahim, what would you add to understanding this maxim better?
Yeah, al-mashaqqatu tajlibu taysir. It's all about hardship calls for relaxation of law. Hardship calls for easing the law in the interest of the victim. It is much more in tandem with other tools of or secondary tools of usul al-fiqh, that are secondary sources of law, such as maslaha, public interest, istihsan, which is discretionary or juristic preference, and saddu zari'ah, blocking means. So hardship begets facility in a number of issues. You know, when we look at our worship, Islam as a religion, Allah say, وَمَا جَعَلَ لَا يُكَلِّفُ اللَّهُ نَفْسًا إِلَّا وُسْعَهَا. So when you start finding difficulty beyond what you can handle, Islam is not like, no, you have to die, you have to suffer. If it has to be Islam, you must suffer. No. And sometimes this hardship come in various forms. Sometimes in form of hardship that is like difficult, but then you will not die. But if you have some relaxation of law, it makes life easier for you. Another level of hardship will come in form of what you call darura. Darura meaning dire necessity. In fact, if care is not taken, it will cost life. Now, the extent to which Islam relaxed the law depends on the severity of the challenge. In very severe cases, haram, halal, wajib, for all of these things can be suspended just to take care of the situation at hand. Whereas in other instances, you can just permit something as a temporary opening to a better ending. So there are instances where, okay, education will be a haja. So the extent to which Islam will allow openings in the name of people having access to education where there is a barrier is different from when it is life at stake. Sometimes also this issue of al-mashaqqatu tajlibu taysir, usually when we look at Shariah from the ahkamu taklifiyya and wada'iyya, there are those declaratory rulings of Shariah that how, when, why, money. Now Shariah will look at it and say, okay, because of this situation, your case is peculiar. So when we look at rulings regarding fasting, a pregnant woman, what kind of concession can she be given in the name of fasting? What of somebody that is incapacitated or overweight? How should he pray? And a number of issues. So sometimes you look at, is it money or is it the ahkamu taklifiyya? There are instances where all the ahkamu taklifiyya can be suspended.
That something is haram or fard.
Yes,
or
all of
makruh.
those could be suspended if life is at stake. You have a typical case of Ammar bin Yasir, when the two of his parents were killed earlier on, and he was forced to commit blasphemy. Of course, he has no choice.
Which would be like shirk.
Like
the
shirk,
greatest of
like the
sins.
greatest of shirk.
But still.
But Islam say, no, you can do it. You have instances also where Sharia will tell you that فَمَنِ اضْطُرَّ غَيْرَ بَاغٍ وَلَا عَادٍ, when Allah outlined all sort of prohibited meat. But he said, whosoever is forced out of necessity, he's not seeking for, doesn't transgress the bound, it's okay.
فَلَا إِثْمَ
فَلَا إِثْمَ عَلَيْهِ. In another, I say, فَمَنِ اضْطُرَّ فِي مَخْمَصَةٍ, is a different in language, usage. That whosoever is pushed to the wall because of hunger. So these kind of things, scholars need to look at al-mashaqqa tajlibu taysir as a relaxation where there is necessity for it. But like as my sister stated earlier, it's not relative based on your own choice. Because if you give human being that choice, even beneficial suffering, people will want to go through. But whoever will come between your way and Sharia, or your way to making life difficult for others, or a policy then scholars need to look at it and make a policy. And so also this issue of al-mashakka tajlibu taysir is not left at the hand of individual per se, but scholars, policy makers, and authorities and experts. They are the ones to finalize or conclude so that we know, okay, this is clearly a mashakka and we need to relax the law.
So the need to not just use a maxim to fling the doors open that everything is halal because you are in difficulty, to recognize that on certain issues you would need experts to advise on what would be the policy for giving relief. Though I guess at the same time there would be those issues where you are the best one to decide how sick you are to break your fast, or what's your own level of difficulty. Or sometimes you may want the advice of a doctor in that regard. Ala Ibrahim, just to carry on, and I like this issue of distinguishing between ad-darar yuzal and mashakka tajlibu taysir, because there are some people who, because they are involved in removing the problem of poverty and dealing with the economy and dealing with the administrative system and countering corruption, they forget the victim, the person who needs food today. You are so focused on the big problem of a darar yuzal that you forget to bring taysir and ease to the person who is going through difficulty. So this double concern for harm, both where it is coming from, but also on the side of the victim. What other legal maxims are there that are related to this maxim of mashakka tajlibu taysir, or hardship calling for ease or concessions?
Okay, number one, you have ad-darurat tubihul mahzurat, meaning that necessities make harams temporarily halal. In other words, under dire necessities, all laws can be suspended. Simply this is what it means, because mahzurat are the extreme. Wajib becomes irrelevant to save life. So somebody can actually suspend his salat to save life. Okay? You can take haram if that's the only way you can save somebody. Also, they will tell you that yutahammalu dararul akhassu, okay, li daf'u dararul a'am, that you can tolerate, you can forgive, you can waive, you can, undertake a minor harm to ward off a bigger harm. They will also say yani la yunkaru taghyir al-hukm bi taghyir hal aw ahwal, that it is natural, it is like known that rulings will change as situation change. So context sometimes dictates what exactly happens here. So you see, these kind of things give Islam that kind of flexibility and compassion and that mindset of reality, Because if Islam is such a religion that say you must at all costs, wait first, but some people will die. You say you must. I'm not in position to do ablution now. You have to, because that's the law. I have a head injury, you say you have to. Islam is not that kind of religion. So you look at issues. So these are some of the maxims. Now,
Sister Salah, what would you add to this issue of other maxims or principles that are used in the application of this maxim?
One of such sub-maxims or related maxims is the maxim which states that where you have a minor haram, something that is mildly prohibited, or haram of the means, that is something which is prohibited because it leads to a greater haram, a greater prohibited thing, would be made permissible, as Brother Ibrahim Nasir Bello mentioned, to the extent which is required, it would be made permissible. This is the kind of concession that would be given to someone in a condition of difficulty. An example of such is a companion, Zubair ibn Awam, who had a skin condition where he was reacting to certain fabrics. It made his skin irritable. And one fabric that he did not react to was silk. But silk is haram for men. Therefore, he sought permission and was given to wear clothes made of silk to relieve that difficulty for him. Another example is of a companion who in a battle sustained an injury to his nose. And initially he had a mold made. So of course the injury it was over, so to speak. It wasn't a matter of life and death, he was still alive. But you can imagine having a nose that has been cut off and you're walking around like that. Even if you are comfortable with yourself, the looks and the stares you keep getting from people who see you for the first time, or some people who find it hard to stand the sight of that, can be psychologically distressful. So he then had a mold made of silver at first. And when he had that made, it started to irritate his skin. So he wanted to use gold. Again, like silk, gold is prohibited for Muslim men. So he sought permission and was given permission to have a mold made of gold, which no longer irritated his skin and allowed him to live a practically normal life. Yet another example, which we've used before, is exposing the aura for purposes of for medical reasons, or even in some cases for safety. So you might have someone who is running away from a fire or from a mad dog, and let's say a woman, and she's wearing a dress. She has to hike it up if she wants to run or she wants to vault over a fence. You can imagine how ridiculous it would be at that point for somebody to be saying, I saw when you were running and you raised your dress this high, and etc., etc. So these are some of the examples that come with that sub-maxim. Another sub-maxim is the one where it said that if a society or a community or a group, they find themselves in a situation of haja. Haja means difficulty.
That is not as extreme as
Not
darura.
as extreme as darura. It's not dire necessity. The simplest way people say it is it's not a matter of life and death. It's just life has become a bit constrained, difficult. That if a community, a group of people is suffering that, they are treated as though, as an individual who is in a state of dire necessity would be treated. What this means is that if it's an individual, then we are saying this person is in a state of dire necessity, is in a state of life and death. Life is now hanging, or it has been pushed to the extreme. The living condition is extreme. That situation is equal to a large number of people facing constraints and difficulty. The reason being that, or the hikmah, the wisdom behind it, is if you have that number, such a high number of people in a state of difficulty, eventually, one by one, they would start falling into a state of dire necessity. And if you have that large number falling into a state of dire necessity, you've got a massive problem on your hand. So to prevent that, again, we see ourselves going back to ad-darar yuzal. Hardship must be prevented. To prevent that, they are now given the same ruling. So concessions are given. For instance, when maybe a community is facing famine or conflict situation, crisis, war, the hard punishments are suspended. And Brother Ibrahim Bello touched on this. We have another example from Sirah, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, where the Prophet ﷺ and a group of his companions intended to perform Hajj. They got to Mecca. Before they reached the city, they were blocked by the Meccans, the polytheists, who said, you are not going to perform Hajj this year, you can't come in. And the Prophet ﷺ then engaged with them in negotiations. And there were certain terms that they insisted must be part of the treaty, which were considered unfair. Really, on this, one thinks of them, they were unfair. Terms such as, if a polytheist chooses to become a Muslim, the person will not be allowed to join the Prophet and the companions in Medina. But if a Muslim decides to become a polytheist, the person should be allowed. And the companions were up in arms and saying, that's not balanced, it's not fair. But the Prophet, peace be upon him, considered that point and several other terms. His thinking was long-term. Again, that thing of the entire community is in Hajj, not being allowed to perform Hajj this year. One person being forced to stay in Mecca, even as a Muslim, is hard on that person. But when it's weighed against the common good, because another term, a vital term of that treaty, was no war for the next 10 years. It means all the people dying in wars, Muslims, non-Muslims, the crisis that follows, the shortages of food that came with that, all of that would be prevented. So when weighed, the Prophet ﷺ made these concessions. And when we look in more recent times, the COVID-19 protocols, some of those protocols were causing difficulty for individuals. But the idea behind the fatwas given by fatwa councils and muftis saying, yes, you should actually obey these protocols was for the consideration of the general good, public interest, and not just general good in the present times, but what will happen in the next year, in the next 2 years, what would happen looking forward.
Thank you very much. This is interesting how from the maxim of al-mashakka tajlibu taysir, that hardship or suffering calls for ease, we find the relationship between that and the other maxim, which you cited, that ad-darurat tubihul mahzurat, that darura and necessity make permissible those things that are prohibited. And Malam Ibrahim gave us a number of examples, and he even went to say that all the rulings of Sharia can be relaxed for the sake of darura, and of course biqadriha, you would of course weigh
to its extent.
But then, as you mentioned, moving from that, and I think Maulana Ibrahim raised this maxim, that a greater harm may be averted by permitting a minor one. That a greater harm may be may be stopped by permitting a smaller haram. And it's interesting how the scholars identified the smaller harams. And you mentioned those things that are minor sins. So we have the major sins, we've got the minor sins. So of course a minor one is less serious than a major one. But also there are certain things that are haram from a saddu zariya point of view, so to speak. They are haram not because there's a problem with them, but because they lead to other harams. Exposing the aura, exposing part of what would be your private part of your body is wrong, but the big concern is something worse than that. And by identifying which is greater, which is lesser, scholars are able to then say, looking at how these things were done at the time of the Prophet, the concessions made for people who are not in darura. In other words, these concessions don't apply to just people in darura, but you've mentioned when there's a haja, which is a difficulty less than darura, less than a dire necessity. It may be just a very inconveniencing thing, like moving around with a nose that was cut, or moving around, or skin
itchy,
or maybe you have an infection, a fungal infection or something where maybe it'll go in the next few days, or maybe you've got a cough, but maybe it'll turn into something worse, and you go to see the doctor. You're not in darura, but the doctor can touch you. The doctor can feel your pulse, can do things. Even though you are not in darura, you are in haja, but what the doctor is doing under normal circumstances would be considered permissible, because it is to avert a darura, but it's a minor wrong. But then you also mentioned how when a haja is affecting a community, it's treated like a major wrong. In other words, darura, which is the major one, seems to be what haja to a community is equated to, and then certain things like hudud laws being relaxed, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, you gave examples, in the interest of the common good. I'd like to move on to the subject of the evidence for these maxims, starting, of course, more importantly with the major one, al-mashakka tajlibu taysir. What kind of evidence do we have from the Quran and from the Sunnah? And some have already been cited. We've seen in the Sunnah this in progress. But are there any more that you can give so that we understand why this maxim has joined the universal ones?
Okay. It has joined the universal ones because of its universal application, because of the tawatur evidence for it. And some of these, let's look at the Quran. There are those ayahs where Allah underscores that what He wants for us is ease, not difficulty. A very common one, Yuridullaha bikumul yusra wa la yuridu bikumul usra. Allah desires for you, wishes for you, wants for you ease. He does not want for you difficulty. And the important thing to note is that verse came when Allah was talking about fasting and saying this is what you should do, this is what you should do. So people sometimes say it's important that one reflects on that, the context of that, the textual content, that fasting is considered a difficult thing to do. Yet Allah closes that section by mentioning this, implying that thing we said before, that this isn't just about any difficulty, it's to what extent. But we also see the textual evidence for this al-mashaqqa tajlibu taysir coming from those concessions that Allah grants, even when it comes to fasting, which is one of the pillars of Islam. Concessions for those who are sick, concessions for the aged, concessions based on other factors. So we also have where Allah talks about that He has not put in this religion hardship. So everything about the deen is meant to promote life, is meant to bring benefit. And when Allah says He has not put any hardship in it, He is saying any hardship that is not necessary, that is not beneficial, that will actually hinder you. And I think Brother Ibrahim alluded to that when he said some people consider anything easy as not Islamic or not Islamic enough. If it's difficult, aha, now you are holy, now you have Iman. The tougher it is, the more Imanic you are. But we have the hadith that tells us where Aisha radiallahu anha has said that if the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had several options, he would pick the easiest one. As long as it's halal, he would instantly go with that. We have the statement where it said that this religion, Allah brought it, and He brought it with ease, full of kindness and wide, and He didn't bring it narrow. So Islam, narrow here is talking about that thing you mentioned, constraint, choking. So Islam is not meant to do that. So as I said, sometimes the maxims help me find common sense. So if in practice you are following the normal requirement of the practice of the deen, and you keep experiencing that sense of choking or difficulty, it's a signal that slow down. Maybe the way you are interpreting the deen, you've interpreted it wrongly. This is why there's now hardship on you. Maybe this thing that you believe is compulsory upon you, there's actually a concession that has already been granted by Allah. Maybe your practice of this is going beyond bounds, but you are not yet aware. So we also have, I think I can add one last one, where the Prophet ﷺ was being told by Allah that you have been sent not to bring difficulty, but to bring ease. When we look at these verses of the Quran and these ahadith that keep mentioning difficulty, ease, width, narrowness, it leads to one conclusion, that there is meant to be concession where difficulty arises, that's not necessary, that the default position is things should not be unnecessarily difficult.
Thank you very much. Allah Ibrahim, what would you add to
This is interesting. And like he said, there are hadith that shows that it doesn't have to be difficult to be Islamic. Typically, a number of them, of course. One day the Prophet ﷺ was on a journey with Sahabas, and it was a very harsh weather. Some chose to fast, some did not. The day was hot. The Prophet himself was fasting. And somewhere around afternoon, he saw somebody has collapsed. They were sprinkling water on him. Say, what is happening? People gathering around him. They say, Ya Rasulullah, who was him? He's fasting. Say, why? He has a choice. He said, Ya Rasulullah, I say, because you did not break, you are fasting too. Subhanallah. Because the Prophet was sent as a mercy, the Prophet ordered for water and broke his fast. So what am I trying to underscore? The Prophet was sent as a mercy. And Islam is not about it must be difficult, that's what it is. Why is it Islam? Some chose to, some not to. And he even told them there's nothing special about fasting when you're on journey. So a number of Islamic rulings show this. You have this ruling of tayammum when you don't have water. Or you have water, you cannot use it because of a particular ailment. You have shortening of prayers when you travel. In fact, if you travel, many nawafil, many scholars of the opinion that even many nawafil you are used to doing, you can suspend them and you still be rewarded. You have issues that a woman during her monthly period is exempted from fasting and doing salat. And a number of these kind of instances where Islam already has that kind of mechanism that even the 5 daily salah that are obligatory, if you cannot stand because of weakness, maybe you're sick or you're very old, you can sit. In fact, scholars have categorization of, okay, what if you cannot sit? They say you can lie down. Like Islam has this kind of realistic approach. That's what I say. It's about being realistic. It's not a religion that you must do or die. No. So a number of ahadith and many other verses and examples in the Prophet's life and how he related to the Sahabas, and like Aisha said, the Prophet has never been given a choice between two. And he chose the difficult one. In fact, sometimes the Prophet will warn Sahabas. He say, yassiru wa la tu'assiru. You know, like, make things easy for the people. You don't have to make it difficult. No. In fact, a Sahabi was reported once to have led his prayer, his people in his community, in Isha'i prayer. And he recited Surah Al-Baqarah. Subhanallah. That's 286 verses. And somebody came.
A lot of reward, right?
Wonderful. But then that's not it. You're making people see Islam as one difficult thing.
Exactly.
Somebody came and he couldn't bear it. He just said salam and said his own Ishai and left. And the next day they reported, thinking the Prophet will condemn the person. The Prophet said, Ya Mu'az, aturidu anta kuna linnasi fatanan? You want to become a terror? You know, that kind of thing.
A fitna for people.
Fitna, exactly. Yeah. That's what it means. So Islam is not about it must be difficult before it is Islam. And there are a number of texts and ahadith that shows that Prophet himself tried to. Look at it. Somebody came to ask Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You know, like the man prayed actually in a very rough manner. You know, that kind of hit and run prayer. And he came back and said, Assalamu alaikum ya Rasulallah. The Prophet said, Alaikum salam, go back. Innaka lam tusalli. After the third time, he said, I saw by God who has sent you as a prophet. This is the best I can do. What I'm trying to show, when the Prophet was teaching him prayer, he made it so simple, the simplest way. That just do this, just do, you know, like it makes simple. But what do we teach people Islam at the beginning, and we want them to absorb everything? So we should understand that this issue of, you need to start from simple. And when people are getting it difficult, please look very well, There's always a room, need to relax.
This is really interesting on the need to really emphasize taysir, making things easy for people who are in difficulty. You know, the moment you hear somebody is going to hospital, you need to be really careful about coming up with laws, because by definition, this person is either in haja or darura and some kind of concession. This person is in search of rahmah, in mercy, you know, in search of taysir. I recall during the life of the Prophet ﷺ, as a rule, zakat is to be given out once every year after your 12 lunar calendars have passed. But
lunar months.
Lunar months, sorry. And but we do have times when the Prophet would actually ask some of those Sahaba who are giving zakat whether they would be ready to give 2 years or 3 years zakat in advance because of the current difficulty. And of course, when the following year comes, these people are exempted from zakat. And based on that, scholars even did the other way around, that there are times when if we know in the next few months we would really need more money, then we would actually delay the disbursement of zakat. And you can, so instead of giving it when it's due, to actually delay and make sure you are there to solve the problem. In contemporary societies, that may go to school fees at a particular time, especially if you're taking care of orphans or relatives that are in need. I remember an interesting fatwa that was given by a scholar where he said classical scholars actually would say, if a shepherd, say, had a dog and you're taking care of your sheep or security or or a pet, and the only water available is what you have for wudu, and it's not enough for more than that, but your dog is thirsty, then let the dog have the water. That is removing a greater harm, and you have an alternative of doing tayammum. So interesting how this weighing of harm was not just to you, but how if your brother's in trouble, so are you. If your pet is in trouble, so are you.
Indeed.
If your ward is in difficulty, so are you. The difficulty of the other, you are actually expected to, so it's what is usually what you call, oh, should I expose my aura to the doctor? Under normal circumstances, exposing your aura is haram. Touching the aura is also haram. But it becomes halal for the doctor, not because he is in darura or she is in darura, but your darura makes it no more haram. So whether it's the person who is helping you or the person who is helped, that darar must be removed. That mashakka calls for taysir and the relaxation of the relevant laws, proportionate to the harm. And tied to this, the whole issue of really identifying victims in our society. Some are young people who are finding it difficult to do certain things. They need to make it easy. Some are converts or reverts, people who have just embraced Islam. They need to make things easy. Some are the elderly, or some are just just find it difficult to not look at it as mashakka is a maqasid. No, it's actually a mafasid. It's actually a harm from the Sharia perspective. Taysir, making things easy, is the maqasid. Allah makes it clear. Allah yuridu bikumul yusra. Allah wants ease. The question I'd like to move to, after having, we've established this issue of the evidence for mashakka tajribu taysir and what we keep repeating about these maxims, is that the maxim is a conclusion of many texts. So when somebody quotes a maxim, they are actually quoting the conclusion of many verses of the Quran and Hadith. What I'd like us to look at next is more examples of the application of this maxim or this principle, al-mashakka tajlibu taysir, to contemporary contexts. Malam Ibrahim, what are some examples that you would give that would help us appreciate the application of this maxim?
Okay, al-mashakka tajlibu taysir in a number of things. When we look at, for instance, what the Prophet did during the Sulh of Hudaybiyah was actually concession of some laws and rules that were not necessarily in favor of Muslims in a short term, but for long-term interest. So where we have Muslims in a multi-religious society, some constitutions have done that by adopting or dropping some of the, what are likely to be stumbling blocks to peaceful coexistence temporarily. For example, in some countries, they chose to say this law of apostasy. They've considered, not because they did not believe or accept it as part of Islam, but they look at their reality and the unnecessary bottleneck that is going to create. Similarly, scholars allow also, when people are in this kind of difficulty, issues that are debatable among scholars, where some people have difference of opinion, like, okay, haram, halal. Victims of haja, necessity and difficulty, you allow them. Also, you have cases like in the case of divorce now. For many other mazahib, as far as I know, woman doesn't have right to divorce. But Maliki look at khul'u as the woman's right to divorce.
In other words, in the Maliki, even if the husband doesn't agree.
Yeah, of course, that is it. So, if this is in the long-term interest of peace and will solve a problem, scholars have no problem changing their position, whatever mazhab they belong to, because of this. So, issues like this, whenever people are in state of darura or hajj, I would say that before earlier. But in our own reality, some scholars even went as far as saying that a woman can do tawaful wada even when she is menstruating, if it is her time to leave Makkah. Because in the current reality, where you have a book flight, you travel in groups, it's time for you to leave Makkah. And you now have to stay behind. It's going to create difficulties. So because of that, contemporarily, scholars said a woman can do tawaful wada, which is the final or farewell tawaf. To leave Makkah is permissible, just because of this ruling of al-mashakka tajlibu taysir and things like this, including sometimes issues to do with if a woman has some challenges or difficulties where she needs some, like it's necessary for her to fast, or she's afraid if she didn't fast it might cause a problem or any other thing, she can use a drug if it becomes necessary that she must, and a number of issues like that. Yeah.
Salah, what would you add?
I would like to add some. For instance, this question of use of the Ventolin inhaler by asthma patients during Ramadan while they are fasting. Ordinarily, one would look at that and say, no, because you're actually ingesting, in a sense, this thing, because they put it in their mouth and they have to puff the medicine in. But the idea behind that is looking at the concession that can be given to such a person. Because very often, the asthma patients can't even predict when they will have an attack. Then it becomes necessary for them to use the Ventolin inhaler. That's one, without breaking their fast. Another example is the idea of what do we give as zakah? If one goes strictly by the text, there are these grains that must be given as zakah. But you have Muslims all over the world for whom in their culture, they don't regard these things as food, or these particular grains don't even exist. They are not grown, they are not commonly found. So first, for the person given the zakah, where is he or she going to find it? And if he or she does, you give it to somebody, does it meet the aim of giving zakah? Or where it said you can give dates as zakah. In many parts of the world, nobody looks at dates as food. Like, what am I going to do with this basket full or bowl full of sweet stuff?
It's a dessert.
It's a dessert.
Snack.
For some, it doesn't even exist. So the fatwa has been given that you can give cash instead. You can give what for the people of that place actually serves the purpose. Because the whole idea is to remove, to give a concession, to remove a situation from people, to show compassion to a person. So if the zakat does not help the person receiving, it's then important to make changes. Another thing that we can also consider is this thing you mentioned earlier, a revert, a new Muslim. What kind of situation are they dealing with? For some, becoming Muslim creates upheaval in their family setting, sometimes in their places of work, sometimes just in the society itself. Because changing one's religion, whether the person is going from Islam to Christianity or Christianity to Buddhism or whatever, is often a very big shift. So from the Islamic perspective, and fatwa has been given with regard to this, there are concessions given to reverts. Concessions such as a lady becomes a Muslim and she says she's not ready to wear the hijab yet. And it said, let it be. Or certain rituals or habits that have been built over time, such as going out for drinks with friends, TGIF. It said, look, don't chase that. There are fundamentals of the religion, which would include things like, do you believe there is one God? Do you believe the Prophet Muhammad is his messenger? Do you believe in all the other prophets? Start there. Give this concession until the person's faith builds up. which even leads me to a personal experience I remember, and it came to my mind when Brother Ibrahim Bello was talking about the man who couldn't pray Salah well. Where we grew up without actually being taught to do our 5 daily Salats. Our knowledge of Islam was limited. So it wasn't until I think I was in university the first year that I finally agreed to start saying my prayers. I understood the need. I would even say at that time I didn't fully understand the need, but I had come to the point where many reverts get to. I wasn't a revert, but for all intents and purposes, I was like one, where they agreed to submit. Allah is one, and I will submit to what comes with that, even if I don't fully get it yet. So the first time I went home on holiday, my older brother was already at home, and he then said I should join them, meaning himself and my younger siblings, in Salat, that they now all pray Jam'i together. He had been more conscious for a while. And I thought about it. I said, okay, I'll join you people. Let me go get a scarf, and I joined them. And he then said, we do this 5 times a day. I know this story sounds funny even to me now. And I said, 5? He said, yeah. Okay. And then I said, so how many of these do we do? He explained the rak'ah. He said, this one is 2, that is 4, that is 4, that's 3, that's 4. And I thought, I can do that. After a while, then my brother says, there are some extras you can add. I said, what do you mean? He said, when you're done with, let's say 4, you do 2 more. I said, you said it was only 4 at this time, Fa. He immediately said, no problem, leave it. I said, hey, you people get up, be doing your extras. I'm doing my 4. But I got to the point where I came to appreciate the essence of Nawafil at the time. So even for reverts, it's important to always look at that. Another application where we can see this is when it comes to issues around polygamy. That's an emotionally charged topic for many people, where polygamy is permissible. A man can have 1 wife, be monogamous, or can have 2, 3, or 4. But you then have fatwas being given. You have governments coming up with policies where they regulate the practice of polygamy, because they are looking at the hardship that arises when certain practices are not regulated, which would lead sometimes to abuse or even unintentional abuse. And they look at the victims of such abuse, very often the children first of all, and then sometimes the first wife, and in some cases first, second, third, fourth wives. So they then step in to show compassion to the victims and thereby regulate that process. Another is looking at divorce laws, alimony laws, where you would ordinarily say this is a personal matter. And if 2 people decide they don't want to stay married, then they should just work out the terms of that separation. But as we often know, divorce is hardly ever friction-free. It's very often quite filled with bitterness, and it becomes a sort of tug of war. So governments, administrations, they have realized the need to step in and regulate that process, bring in neutral parties. Again, their focus being on who will be impacted adversely if this regulation is not done. So they come in with the mindset of al-mashaqah tajlibu taysir. Some facilitation must be done, some ease must be injected into this process.
Thank you so much. This concern for compassion all the way. Yeah. And Malam Ibrahim mentioned with quite a number of examples. You touched on this issue of even the food items for zakat, and I can imagine parts of the world where their main food is potatoes. Their climate just can't accommodate other crops. In some parts of Africa, Southeast Asia, I know some parts of Nigeria, the staple food would be yam or cassava or some other root crop where grains just don't grow in those areas to a level that become a staple food. And
if I may add, in some of those areas, they actually dismiss grains as substantial food. I know my mother said growing up in our village, they called rice bird food. And if you served people rice, then they would say, "You're giving me bird food. Am I a bird? Give me something
yeah.
solid."
No, this is this reality of certain contexts and the differing opinions of scholars becoming a rahmah to the poor of those areas. So you will find within the Hanafi madhab more openness regarding the categories of zakat. I know in the Maliki madhab, the predominant view is you don't give zakat on tubers, things like potatoes or yam. And here in Nigeria, we will find certain tribes where the predominant food, the staple would be yam, which is like a huge potato. No zakat on agriculture because they have been taught that there's no zakat on this type of crop. And then you find another tribe able to help its own poor in their own way. And so we find, as Malam Ibrahim Bello mentioned, that sometimes scholars would use the differing opinions as a source of creating ease, where the difference of opinion among scholars is used as a rahmah, becomes a rahmah, because it gives you greater choice for people who are victims of haja, of difficulty that may not even be as dire as that of darura. I think an interesting one also is the differing opinions among the schools. You mentioned the case of khulu and how the Malikis interpret khulu as a form of divorce initiated by the wife, but as a right, whether the husband agrees or not, and how some scholars in Asia who follow other madhabs like the Hanafi school, where it's nearly impossible for a woman to get a divorce, even in an abusive relationship or where there's neglect, etc. And those scholars would actually recommend that because of this situation, in some instances, the only way some women could get divorce was to commit apostasy.
Subhanallah.
Yeah, to say, I am no more a Muslim, Allah is not my Lord, and the Prophet is not my Prophet. But because in Hanafi that is fasq, that's an instant breakage of the marriage, then the marriage is broken. Then she repeats her shahada, La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah, I'm now a Muslim, but I'm not tied to that marriage.
That's trickish.
It is trickish, but it was the only way
it's
out.
what Ammar had to do.
Sorry, Ammar?
The companion, when he saw how his parents were killed, in a sense.
Necessity.
Get out, yes, necessity to get out
and
of
this
the
whole issue of what is your intention?
Yeah.
Was the intention she really wants to leave Islam, or just create a legal loophole that gives her concessions? And,
so one
some
has
of
to
the...
look at the conditions that would force a believing Muslim woman to do that.
And that's why, people like Sheikh Ashraf Thanawi, some of the great scholars there said, like, this doesn't make sense. Why not go to the Maliki school and take their understanding instead of leaving people who leave Islam just to get a divorce. But unfortunately, certain missionaries were also helping, and what happened was some left Islam and they didn't come back. Yeah. So, this need to really be sensitive to when your own madhab is creating a problem, to look into the bigger toolbox of scholars and see, where can I meet the maqasid of Sharia? Where can I find ease by going to another school of thought? And so the moment you hear scholars differ on this topic, scholars differ on, and many issues in which there's ijtihad, you'll find differing opinions, to appreciate that the moment somebody is facing haja, you take the easier opinion, and this is a position the scholars have taken on this issue. And I would conclude by, just reminding us that when we talk about these qawaid, as you keep saying, in hindsight, a lot of them are common sense statements. They make sense. They are tools of critical thinking that scholars have derived from the Quran, from the Sunnah, traffic rules for life. that even a non-Muslim who understands these, and I've actually met non-Muslims who, once they listen to a few of these maxims, they kind of like, this is guidance for life, and that's exactly what they are. So instead of just studying them and saying, okay, Islam teaches these, to look at them as tools that you take from Islamic teachings and apply in your everyday life as a Muslim, but even non-Muslims can find this a gateway or a way of actually appreciating the spirit of Islam. I'd like to thank you both for your thoughts, your ideas, your contributions. Jazakumullahu khairan. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.